Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Bow, 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 bow.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radioverse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off by thanking all of you loyal listeners yet again for joining us this weekend. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, July 11th, 2026. We begin with Sister Luyanda Kaboka bringing us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, we get right into things as our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, as well as Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne, is going to be joined on the line by Ellen McLarney, Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at Duke University in North Carolina. For our purposes today, Professor McLarney is author of the book Black Arts, Black Muslims, Islam, and the Black Freedom Struggle. Then, in the second half of our program, Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by Amea Gelman, founding director of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism and author of the book The Anti-Defamation League and Racial State. Finally, we're going to round things off by passing on a relay from Black Agenda Report, where Dr. Horne speaks on the farce of You Lie in an interview with BAR's Margaret Kimberly. Any of you descendants of Africa who found yourself wearing or waving that red, white, and blue proudly last weekend should especially stay tuned for this one, so don't touch that dial. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom, right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 in Los Angeles, and kpfk.org streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Tumani Diabate, Jeremy Pelt, Ulysses Owen, Eric Deutsch, Joe Alterman, and the Modern Jazz Quartet. Now people get ready for this train to come and taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Ellen McLarney.
Hotep. This is Sister Luyanda Koboka with our weekly Freedom Now African Drumbeat historical calendar for the week of July 11th. We present this calendar to give life to our ancestors, regardless of nationality, who have contributed to the plight of the oppressed by raising up in armed struggle, an ideological struggle against those racists, those capitalists, those exploiters who profit from the oppression of the masses of humanity. It is from these historical roots that we dare to struggle today and we dare to win. July 11th, 1968. The American Indian Movement, AIM, was founded in Minneapolis, Minnesota, by Clyde and Vernon Balcourt and Dennis Bank. AIM was patented after traditional Native American resistance movements and the Black Panther Party. AIM provided an alternative to the frustrated youth in Native American reservations throughout the settler colony of United States. AIM was and is a vibrant and militant response to the racism that has characterized traditional people's contact with the white man since their land was first stolen. July 11th, 1905. W.E.B. Du Bois, Monroe Trotter, and others meet in Canada to organize the Niagara Movement, which was the precursor to the NAACP and the contemporary civil rights movement. July 12, 1815, Mariana Grajales was considered the mother of the Cuban Revolution. She mothered and trained 12 Cuban revolutionaries, the most famous being Antonio Maceo, the great general of Cuban independence. Marianne was forced to flee Cuba for her revolutionary work and joined with the Maroons of Jamaica. July 12, 1967. Africans beaten and brutalized by the police spear the Newark, New Jersey uprisings. July 14th, 1789. The masses stormed the Bastille prison in Paris, France, beginning the French Revolution, which was short-lived with the rise from the feudal ashes of the capitalist bourgeois and the spread of French imperialism. July 15th, 1978. American Indians begin the 3,000-mile-long walk to symbolize their continued struggle since the white men came, to regain their traditional lands and culture, and to further consolidate the militant membership of various Native American movements. July 16, 1862. Ida Wells Burnett was born of slave parents and raises her 5 brothers and sisters when both her parents died of yellow fever. She challenges the Jim Crow laws of the United States by refusing to sit in the colors-only section of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad cars, and began one of many struggles against segregation. She led the anti-lynching crusades in 1892 after 3 of her friends were lynched by racist mobs. She was a prolific writer, organizer, and speaker on behalf of African people. July 16th, Queen Zephyrina, in the first half of the 19th century, cried out, "Death to the whites, long live the blacks," which was the war cry of the slave rebels. On December 24th, 1826, Zephyrina planned and led a slave uprising in Urubu, Brazil. 50 men and women using knives, machetes, sickles, and small-bore shotguns rose against their Portuguese so-called masters, setting in motion a long series of rebellions throughout Brazil. July 17, 1898, Maria Libertad Gomez Quirada was born. She founded the Partido Popular Democrático Puerto Rico, an anti-U.S. colonial political movement. This has been Sister Luyanda for Freedom Now on 90.7 FM in Southern California and 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara, and in the language of resistance of our African people. Join us in our chant of freedom. Amandla awetu, amandla awetu, amandla awetu.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Ellen McLarney, Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at Duke University in North Carolina, and author of the book Black Arts, Black Muslims, Islam in the Black Freedom Struggle. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now. KPFK Los Angeles, Ellen McLarney.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Horne.
Well, thank you for joining us. So why did you produce this book?
When I finished my PhD and I first came to North Carolina, I had been living in the Middle East for a long time. And I lived in Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Jerusalem. But when I guess when I got to graduate school, I was studying Islam in the Middle East. I was at Columbia and, there was Islam all around me. And I felt like that's when I started. It's almost like this world came alive that I hadn't been previously tuned into. Growing up in the Midwest in Kansas City, like you, Dr. Horne, I saw that you grew up in St. Louis. But also Kansas City has a very huge Muslim community. But because I went to Catholic school, I grew up in the suburbs, I wasn't tapped into it. And then suddenly, after going into the Peace Corps in Morocco for 2 years, and I went to New York City living, on the edge of Harlem at 122nd Street, it was like, wow, this whole world came alive to me. So even though my PhD was in Arabic literature, after finishing my first book project about women in Muslim women's writings in Egypt, I turned to homegrown Islam in the United States, and there's a pretty substantial Muslim community here in North Carolina too, right down the street from Duke University, and so it was like kind of coming home to local Islam.
And poetry plays a central role in your book. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, the book started out looking at poets in the Black arts movement who converted to Islam and then wrote about Islam in their poetry. Because there's all sorts of Islamic motifs and symbols and Arabic language and Islamic expressions like Allahu Akbar and Alhamdulillah and Salamu Alaikum, like all the kind of really touchstones for Islamic faith like would appear in this poetry. I was very intrigued by this, but also because my own training in poetry in the Muslim world is a lot about how an Islamic poetics is articulated, throughout the centuries, partly through, I would say, a literature that's adjacent to the scripture. And I saw that in the Black arts movement poetry, and yet it was revived in a context, so distant in time and space from its origins, and yet so connected. So that was the original spark, was the interest in the poetry.
And what about drama?
What about trauma?
No, drama.
Drama, yes, drama. So I began looking at the poets, as I said, the kind of the main poets in the Black arts movement who converted to Islam, like Askia Mohammed Touré, Yusuf Iman, Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, Marvin X. Those are the really, and all of those people were not coincidentally also involved in spearheading Black studies in the university here in the United States. So, I was super focused on the poetry, but as the project went on, and especially I read Margot Crawford's book on Black post-Blackness. I think she talks about the mixed media nature of Black arts movement, poetry and art, and I realized it's not just the poetry had visual art. It was in dialogue with the music. There was Amiri Baraka's A Black Mass, which was seen as being kind of the precipitating work of the Black arts movement. And so I began to grapple a little bit more deeply with the different artistic forms, or I would say Islamic art forms in the Black arts movement that included poetry, but also other forms like drama.
And Malcolm X plays a role in your book. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I felt like it was Malcolm X who really, I would say, channeled an older Islam into a newer Islam in the United States. I mean, alongside many other important pioneers, like Elijah Muhammad, like Noble Drew Ali, like in the Ahmadiyya movement. I mean, but he was such a pivotal figure that kind of translated, I would say, an Islam from the African diaspora that became an American Islam in, the 1920s and 1930s, and then became channeled back into a more mainstream Islam. I felt like he was really the kind of touch point for that. But also what's so important about Malcolm X is his use of and dialogue with and engagement with the arts, with himself, with music, and also like the most important intellectuals of the Black arts movement. And so I felt like, it was partly through him that many of these motifs emerged, especially in the aftermath of his assassination.
And you mentioned Marvin X, who, if I'm not mistaken, had some ties to the Golden State, speaking of California. Talk to us about Marvin X.
I really owe this project to Marvin. He's the one who shepherded it from its very beginnings. I was in Argentina with my family doing a project on Muslims in Argentina, but I was obsessed with this project, and all I did was work on this book. And while I was in Argentina, I had one of my students send me his autobiography, Something Proper, and I read it front to back, and then I reached out to him, and he told me, come out to Oakland and we'll meet. And I went out to Oakland. This is in 2019, summer of 2019. And he said, come to my Academy de Corner in Oakland. And so I went straight to an Oakland City corner, and he sat me down. And that's where I got to say my street education in this project began. So he has really, and then eventually Marvin and I invited him to come here to Duke, and Marvin in 2020, it was February 2020, right before the pandemic, and Marvin, myself, and his grandson, James Rhodes, went on a poetry tour during Black History Month And we went up the coast. We went to Philadelphia, and he gave a reading there. We met with Sonia Sanchez. We visited her at her home. We went to New York. He did an interview with WBAI, which is WBAI is kind of a big part of the book also. We met with the daughter of Yusuf Iman, Malika Iman. And then we went to Newark and hung out with Amina Baraka in sub-zero temperatures, where he gave a reading at 360 degrees poetry night when in Newark. Marvin is a key. I felt like he's a key because, he was he was there at San Francisco State when Black Studies was first becoming a discipline, and he converted partly as a conscientious objector, which I think that question of conscientious objection right now at our point in history continues to be a very important issue in terms of protest against America's endless engagement in international wars. And I appreciated Marvin's commitment not only to Islam, but to Black studies, to conscientious objection, and to the arts.
And you mentioned Sonia Sanchez. Talk to us a bit more about her.
She is an incredible inspiration. I honestly started this project looking at her blues book for Blue, Black, Magical Women, which, as you can see from the cover, is the same cover. I approached her and her sons about the cover, using the cover, and the original artist, Ademola Olujibifola, who I just met with at the Studio Museum in Harlem. I got his permission to use it, use the image for the cover, because I felt like that particular book was a inspiration for the project as a whole, and made me see the depth of the engagement with Islam, and how, I would say the engagement with how Islam was like a conduit for people to express not only their political commitments and commitments to the African diaspora and commitments to Black studies, but also, a larger spiritual question, at the bottom of a certain moral economy that pushed back against the dominant, I would say, white culture, or dominant culture in the United States that is of, I would say, questionable ethical character. So Sonia Sanchez, her blues book for Blue, Black, Magical Women, I felt like was the epitome of Black arts expression of Islamic commitments.
Finally, Ellen McLarney, author of the book Black Arts, Black Muslims, Islam, and the Black Freedom Struggle. You mentioned a moment or two ago your residence in Argentina, and you produced a project, if I'm not mistaken, concerning Islam and Africans in that South American country. Could you give us a snapshot of that project?
Yes. So that's kind of a third project that I have not finished, but I did do I did publish a piece in Zain Abdullah's edited volume, the Rutledge Handbook of Islam and Race, about Islam in Argentina. And I just traced the origins of Islam in Argentina are actually similar to Islam across the Americas, which came, they think that perhaps some of the first Muslims maybe came around the time of Christopher Columbus, but then also with the slave trade. And then, various waves of immigration across time for different reasons, like in the U.S. So that project is still pending. Argentina has one of the largest Muslim communities in Latin America. They have a huge mosque in Buenos Aires. They have Muslim schools. It's part of the fabric of life in Argentina.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horne, for inviting me to be here.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Radio Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Amea Gelman, founding director of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism and author of the book, The Anti-Defamation League and the Racial State. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Radio Los Angeles, Amea Gelman.
Thanks so much.
So what is the ADL? What is the Anti-Defamation League? And what role has it played in creating the racial state?
The Anti-Defamation League is a major U.S. political organization. It claims an identity as a Jewish organization, which it is. It's not a Jewish organization, but it's particularly a conservative, a right-wing Jewish organization that comes out of the upper classes and a particularly white segment of Jews who emigrated from Germany rather than from Russia or the Russian Empire, as we are often sort of taught to think about U.S. Jewish history. So I'll revise now and say it's a right-wing Jewish organization that has been around since 1913. And whose primary purpose has been to sort of curate a version of Jewishness that is aligned with the state, aligned with capitalism, individualism, the ideas that we have come to understand as cover for racism, like meritocracy and the conflation of things like anti-Semitism with other forms of racism, like anti-Blackness, without any regard to the historical origins or the meanings or the structures of those things. And in the course of its 100 years, it's also it was formed as a settler organization with a commitment to the same kind of white supremacy, settler ideals, capitalism, industrial development that many U.S. political organizations were formed with. It's not special in that regard. Over the course of its 113 years, that settler capitalist origin morphed into various things. It has most significantly become a Cold War anti-communist organization, but it carried that sort of ideological commitment into becoming a major education organization in the United States. So it's got educational programming in probably every location, every locale in the United States. It's become a sort of go-to organization when people are concerned that there's been an incident of anti-Semitism, but also racism. And so, for example, if there's, an incident, an anti-Black incident in a school, for instance, often it's the ADL that is called in, kind of as a perceived expert on discrimination writ large. And it's also a major legislative advocate, pursuing various kinds of laws. Generally speaking, at this point, those are laws about to expand the power of policing and surveillance. In the past, it actually has contributed to the legal, I guess we could call it legal progress in trying to legislate against housing and employment discrimination, but always very much within the bounds of trying to preserve and shore up the state by kind of ameliorating its racist and discriminatory impacts, rather than actually trying to shift the structure and redistribute power. And now, in the present, it's become a major cheerleader for the genocide in Palestine, a major inventor of a crisis, the so-called crisis of anti-Semitism that targets, among others, Jews, Palestinians, the movement against genocide, and that is largely led by people of color and anti-Zionist Jews. And it's also become a lawfare organization. Just last year, it sort of announced that it has a new stable of white shoe law firms who are using civil rights law to prosecute and criminalize, essentially, opponents of genocide. So it wears an awful lot of hats. It's very well connected both to political power and to donor power, and it's also connected to the Israeli state. But one thing I'll just say to close is that I think it's really a mistake to think of it as primarily interested in Israel. It's primarily interested in Western colonialism and what we're now hearing the Christian right identify as the effort to save Western civilization and defend it against the hordes. The ADL has been doing that for a very long time.
So you begin your book with an incident from 1993 when the Anti-Defamation League is involved with the San Francisco Police Department in a spying scandal. In the interest of full disclosure, I should mention that I was one of the targets of this scandal, so to speak. That is to say, in Los Angeles, 30-odd years ago, I was hosting a fundraiser for the African National Congress, and present was a then leader, Chris Hani, who was also leader of the armed wing of the ANC and a leader of the South African Communist Party. And we were spied on, and interestingly enough, the person who was spying on us might have noticed that Mr. Hani's security was rather porous. And returning to South Africa, he was assassinated, and he was the presumed successor to Nelson Mandela. I'm wondering if you have anything to add with regard to that spying scandal.
Yes. So my book, my forthcoming book, has a chapter that looks at the ADL spying scandal in the context of a new piece of research which illustrates the ADL's very tangible connection to the family of neoconservative policymakers that carried out soft power incursions into Central America, into the Philippines, and also into South Africa with the intention of undermining leftist Marxist movements, whether they were resistance movements against dictatorships or whether they were already in power, like the Sandinistas. So the spying scandal, which I just briefly narrate it actually for a sec. So the spying scandal began when the ADL published in one of its newsletters on what it was terming extremism, black extremism, in particular, a piece of information about the Nation of Islam that FBI officers recognized as classified information. And we're like, where did they get this? And so the ADL's offices were raided. They found not only that the that the ADL rather had been infiltrating and spying directly on organizations, mostly in the Bay Area, but also that they had acquired somehow the files of a San Francisco police unit surveillance project, which was essentially an anti-left and anti-counterculture surveillance project that had been deemed unconstitutional and was supposed to be disbanded and the files destroyed. Rather than destroying the files, the ADL had acquired them. And so the total contents was surveillance of something like 10,000 individuals and 6,000 organizations. But the ADL had also directly been spying on many groups, including the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, whose director had been killed in a bombing of that office at the time that the ADL's spy had integrated himself so closely with the organization that he was actually running security for some events and had lists of names of participants, etc. So what it turns out is that the list of organizations that the ADL had been spying on didn't really make sense until it sort of was, cross-matched, I guess, with the organizations in the Bay Area who were supporting Marxist movements that the CIA and the sort of branches of the AFL-CIO that were involved in neocon soft power incursions were also trying to destabilize. So there was a very close match between the CIA's targets and the ADL's spying investigations. And it turns out that the ADL's surveillance czar, whose name was Irwin Sewell, who had joined in 1967 at the moment that neocons had split from the New Left so that they could continue to support the Vietnam War, which they were interested in because it was, in their view, an anti-communist measure. That surveillance czar, who had initiated all of the spying, was in close contact and, in fact, a close comrade of many of the sort of other actors in the neocon soft power game. So those would include Tom Kahn, who was part of the AFL-CIO's little network of soft power developing organizations, Penn Kemble, Eugenia Kemble, Bayard Rustin, actually, who was doing exactly that kind of work in South Africa at the time, and others, including actually somewhat more tangentially connected, but still connected, was Elliot Abrams, who was a major figure in the Iran-Contra scandal. That's what I can add to the spying scandal.
I see. Speaking of which, what was the role of the ADL during the Red Scare and the Cold War?
Well, the ADL came to power. It sort of moved from being a particularist Jewish organization to being what I would call a quasi-state organization at the start of the Cold War, because it was providing a sort of anti-communist, anti-discrimination messaging. It was doing that through advertising, where it was calling on Americans to abandon their sort of easy discrimination. They actually were interested primarily in religious discrimination against Jews and Catholics, and occasionally they would throw in their advertising, they would throw a blackface in there and be like, "Look, don't discriminate. Everybody's the same," which was a way of, as you've written, a way of sort of sanitizing the United States' reputation as it tried to project its power into a global sphere, and encountered problems because people in other parts of the world were like, "But isn't the United States like incredibly racist?" And so the ADL's efforts to try and shape non-discriminating citizens without redressing any of the sort of structural causes or impacts of racism, and its willingness to do that, to sort of become the education organization that the United States state needed to kind of do that propagation, made it really valuable to the state. And the content of that education was quite deliberately and completely anti-communist. So, for example, they created in 1951 a text for educators called How You Can Teach About Communism. It was co-written by an ex-military PSYOPs guy. And its intention was, as it stated very overtly, to teach teachers how to counter arguments that their students might make, saying, well, I'm interested in opposing racism, and it looks like the Soviet Union is trying to do that, so I'm interested in, Soviet communism. And the text very concretely and clearly told teachers what to say about why racism could never be solved by communism, why capitalism and individualism were the only possible route, and then a bunch of other sort of tidbits, I would say, about Soviet and communist history to try and to smear it, to sully it. So, I mean, that was just the sort of ADL's entry into the Cold War, and then they sort of, over and over, just did whatever they could to denounce communism and communists, including purging leftists from major Jewish organizations, which is a project that they undertook in conjunction with the American Jewish Committee and the Jewish Federations, which is the major charitable sort of pool of money that funds Jewish communal institutions. They advocated for the prosecution of the Rosenbergs, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, for prosecution for sharing secrets with the Soviet Union. And in fact, the judge who sentenced them to execution was a member of the ADL Civil Rights Committee. They collaborated with the McCarthy administration, trying to offer McCarthy's research folks the access to their files so that they could know which Jews to go after and which not. So on and on. And it continues. The ADL is still a Cold War organization, targeting anybody that it considers communists, including calling anti-Zionist Jews Soviet ops, basically.
What do you have to say about so-called, quote, black anti-Semitism, unquote?
The ADL's fixation with what they call black anti-Semitism really crystallized between 1967 and 1969 around the Ocean Hill-Brownsville teacher strike and school experiment, which was an experiment that was undertaken by Black and Puerto Rican parents in Brooklyn whose schools were just incredibly racist and abandoned. The teachers, who were almost exclusively white, had decided, they'd sort of given up, decided that kids couldn't learn. It was just a horrible situation. And so the parents won through protest, essentially, an experimental school district that they were able to control, in which they were invited to sort of take over. And in the course of that, the district leader asked to transfer 19 white teachers out of the district because they understood that these teachers were part of the problem. And it turned out that most of those teachers were Jewish because of the ways that that history and immigration patterns creates employment niches for different sets of people. So many of the white teachers in New York City were Jewish, and they got transferred. And the teachers union, the UFT, decided to make this into a case about anti-Semitism. The ADL went along with it and went from efforts that had been making in just before, like 1966, 1967, to stop people from panicking about Black radicalism, doing a complete 180, declaring a crisis of Black anti-Semitism, and creating a witch hunt, really, that resembles so closely what's happening right now. Just declaring that Black anti-Semitism was everywhere and going after officials who they deemed had inadequately responded to it, and essentially charging that because Black communities had turned to the left, had become more overtly and concretely anti-colonial in their approach to racism, that was making them anti-Semitic. So it's a sort of anti-third worldist, anti-communist, anti-decolonial construction of blackness, which, is an old story.
Finally, Amea Gelman, founding director at the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, author of the book, The Anti-Defamation League and the Racial State. Whether the ADL today, in light of the Iran war, in light of the growing unpopularity of Israel because of its role in this conflict, the growing unpopularity of Prime Minister Netanyahu, what has that to do, if anything, with the trajectory of the ADL?
Well, interestingly, my contention is that the ADL has followed along with the interests of the U.S. state. And for a long time, that meant liberalism, claims about liberalism, and the sort of capitalist underpinnings of liberalism. At this moment, obviously, the United States and the Israeli government have both abandoned the pretense of liberalism, and therefore, so has the ADL. So we see the ADL now, doing that thing where it pretends that it didn't see Elon Musk make a Nazi salute. It says like, oh, he's just he's like awkwardly stretching or something. They have removed from their, for a long time, they've maintained a glossary of white supremacist organizations. They've removed that from their website. And they, at their most recent Never Is Now conference, supposedly on anti-Semitism, but actually on Zionism, they hosted, and the ADL CEO hosted a live podcast episode with two MAGA pastors. So they've just sort of fully merged with the white nationalist and often Christian right. I mean, to be clear, the white nationalism is also a multiracial project, so I don't want to confuse, but they've just sort of abandoned the pretense of liberalism in favor of this claim that they are protecting Western civilization against the Muslim, Black, left, anti-Zionist Jewish hordes who are attacking it.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Amea Gelman. But thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
Good day, and thank you so much for joining Black Agenda Report. This week, Black Agenda Report is giving special attention to the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, which was signed on July 4th, 1776. We acknowledge this date while, of course, living up to our mission of providing news, commentary, and analysis from the Black left. So who better to join us in this effort than Dr. Gerald Horne, professor at the University of Houston and a prolific author whose 2014 book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America, will be the focus of our discussion. Thank you so much for coming back, Dr. Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's talk about these dates and holidays for Black people. There's a lot of contradiction there with the 4th of July. I think most people they may not know the history in depth that you've been discussing, but they know our ancestors were enslaved. They know that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were slaveholders, and I believe most of those who signed the Declaration of Independence were slaveholders. I don't know if it's most, but it's a large portion. So I think people know this, but it's still this holiday, a day off, a day of people travel, family, friends, cookouts, etc. In general, what are your thoughts about these problematic dates and Black people?
Well, we should call it the farce of July as opposed to the 4th of July, because it's like asking turkeys to celebrate Thanksgiving, for example. Turkey should not be celebrating Thanksgiving, and you can make a credible argument that the revolt against British rule, as I foreshadowed a few moments ago, was instigated and fomented in no small measure because there was a fear that abolitionism was spreading in London, and this provided a danger to the major investment of the enslaving class. Indeed, on the verge of the U.S. Civil War in 1861, the investment in the bodies of the millions of enslaved Africans was the most profitable and lucrative and sizable investment in the entire republic. And so, once again, I understand where there is an impetus on the part of some to try to forge a kind of unity. That is to say, unity today and then trying to find a historical precedent for it going back. But I think that that's basically a fool's errand in terms of going backward and trying to find a unity between enslavers and enslaved. And I understand it as well because we recognize that with regard to the European invaders, there was class collaboration. That is to say, that many poor Europeans did benefit from 1776, as I suggested a few moments ago. I've told the story more than once about the Cherokees, who were dominant in what is now the southeast quadrant of the United States of America, and sought to assimilate by converting to Christianity, enslaving Africans, etc. And many of them became quite wealthy, but when Andrew Jackson, Mr. Trump's favorite president, embarks on the so-called Indian removal of the late 1820s, early 1830s, these rather affluent Cherokees, they had to go too. And you had Europeans fresh off the boat who could move into their mansions, for example. So therein lies the so-called American dream. And so I understand why many defined as white celebrate July 4th, just as many of us whose ancestors died fighting against the creation of this so-called republic now term and denote it accurately as the farce of July. Which brings me to another point, which is that the creation of the United States is seen as a great leap forward for humanity, even if you set aside genocide and mass enslavement, because supposedly it led to an expansion of civil liberties. But if you look at the First Amendment and religious liberty, you should look at that in a materialist fashion, not to see it as something coming magically from the brains of intellectuals like Thomas Jefferson. That is to say that it helped to expand the ranks of those who were going to fight the indigenous and keep the Africans in line. In fact, in my book on Southern California, my most recent book on Southern California, I pointed out that one of the chief so-called Indian fighters in San Diego County was a Jewish American man. And therein you begin to see the, quote, value, unquote, of religious liberty. That there's a material basis for it because you need numbers in order to subdue the indigenous and fight the Africans. And likewise, with regard to the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, I guarantee you, did not apply to the indigenous. In fact, it was sort of an anti-Second Amendment, by any means necessary to keep guns and weapons out of the hands of the indigenous, out of the hands of the Africans. And to a certain extent, that still holds true. And so, once again, I think that those who consider themselves materialists, in the first instance, should do a materialist analysis of the creation of this republic. And it might help them to understand why we're on the verge of neo-fascism. It might help us to understand why this so-called revolutionary republic turned against what you would think it was this comrade in arms, speaking of the Haitian Republicans of the early 1800s, for example, still hostile, speaking of the Trump regime, to Haiti to this very day, or why the United States of America has been hostile to the Cuban Revolution, for example, hostile to virtually every revolution that has ensued since the 1790s, for example. There is so much to carp about with regard to 1776 that I could probably spend the rest of the many hours we have in store to look forward to with regard to Black Agenda Radio to going on.
I thank you, and I recommend to our viewers and listeners, if you have not read this book, you must. You've written so many books, but we'll just for this week recommend The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America. I think it is a work that belongs in every library. Thank you so much for joining me again, Dr. Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Professor Ellen McLarney, representing Duke University in North Carolina, and author of the book Black Arts, Black Muslims, Islam in the Black Freedom Struggle. We also thank Amea Gelman from the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, as well as author of the book The Anti-Defamation League and Racial State. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Shout out to Sister Luyanda Kaboko on the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week, as well as to our spiritual backbone, Freedom Now founder and ancestor Baba Didan Kamati. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne, and you can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org. That's not all. Go to the audio archives on kpfk.org, scroll down to Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. With that, we send you off, and until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.